Giallo horror is a unique subgenre of film that was founded in Italy and marries elements of horror and mystery into one. It's got a style so distinct that it can't be confused with anything else. In fact, Giallo has survived for so long that there's elements of its style that are even being adopted into Hollywood horror movies. The then unnamed genre first appeared in the 1960s when Italian horror directors began utilizing the film noir look for their movies. Deep shadows, sharp lighting contrasts, striking shot compositions. These were all early Giallo traits that have since come to be expected from the genre. However, Giallo itself started earlier than this. The word Giallo literally translates to yellow in Italian, which is of course based off of the yellow-paged murder mystery detective novels that were published in Italy. The first ones popped up in the 1930s, but Giallo novels became a lot more prominent in the 40s and 50s, with Agatha Christie, Edgar Wallace, and Ellery Queen being some notable authors. The themes found within the novels translated onto screen pretty seamlessly, and while Mario Bava's The Girl Who Knew Too Much is the technical first Giallo film, it wouldn't be until his follow-up, Blood and Black Lace, that the style of filmmaking would really take off. So what separates Giallo from traditional horror movies is that they often showcase creatively complex, albeit unrealistic deaths. They have themes that are sexual in nature, and they often house scores that are memorably jarring and juxtaposed. Giallo has survived for so long as a genre that it's kind of formed a set of characteristics that have become more or less widely accepted. We have modern films like The Editor, Let the Corpses Tan, and The Strange Color of Your Body's Tears that actually act as direct love letters to the genre. So I'm actually going to be going back further, tackling 3 different films, one from the 60s, one from the 70s, and one from the 80s, to see just how Giallo has transformed over the years. With that being said, let's take a look at Mario Bava, the original founder of Giallo. Bava got his origins in the world of filmmaking in the late 50s when he was co-directing horror movies with Riccardo Freda. His work went mostly uncredited, but he eventually solo-directed the movie Black Sunday, which had a moody, gothic atmosphere that Bava would later implement in his future films, one of which being Blood and Black Lace. The film's intro displays a plethora of colors, almost as if to ring in the true coming of the Giallo genre. Mario Bava's vision immediately shines through, giving the film such a strong, palpable atmosphere. The film definitely doesn't waste any time throwing you headfirst into the action, which all starts when Isabella, who's the member of this fashion school boarding house, is murdered by a mysterious masked killer. And not soon after that, Isabella's diary pops up, which has possible evidence that could lead to the identification and arrest of the killer, who obviously doesn't want this diary getting out, so they one by one start picking off members of the fashion boarding school in hopes of finding the incriminating evidence. Now, Blood and Black Lace does something really smart. It's able to keep the audience guessing within the walls of its mystery by using the fashion boarding house as its setting. It introduces a huge cast of characters that all have some ties to Isabella or the murders or the diary, so it really keeps you guessing as the film goes along. The killer themselves dons a black jacket, clothes, and a fedora, topping it off with a white stocking that they wear as a mask. It's a memorable look, and it's one that has features that would become staples in the Giallo genre. As for the movie itself, I found it really entertaining. Going into Blood and Black Lace, I had seen other Giallo movies, but never this one, so it was really interesting to go in and see its undeniable influence that it had on all the other Giallo movies that followed it. At its core, it's a really tightly knit murder mystery, but you pair that with Mario Bava's direction, and you get a really engaging movie. So Isabella's diary, I guess you could call it the film's MacGuffin, is the strongest piece of evidence that this murder case has, and it's more times than not what keeps the plot moving along. That is until it's stolen by a character named Nicole, who tucks it away in a black leather bag. Only for said black leather bag to also be stolen and replaced with a decoy black leather bag. And Nicole, of course, does not notice this. She takes the bag into a secluded part of the boarding house, which leads into what I think to be one of the most fun set pieces in the movie. The killer chases Nicole into the secluded area of the school, and another thing that I love about the fashion school setting is that they're able to play with spotlights and staging in such a unique, dramatic, and fun, but also logical way because of where the film takes place. Now, of course, this action scene culminates in the killer disappearing into darkness and killing Nicole, taking the bag and opening it up, only to find that there's nothing in it. As the movie goes on, bodies continue to pile up, and characters begin to mistrust one another, and the murder case turns into an all-out witch hunt, which is really fun to watch. I think the strongest suit of this movie from a storytelling perspective is its ability to genuinely keep you guessing. I was always thinking of what character may actually be guilty, who's tied to the murder or the disappearance of the diary, and what some characters' motives might have been to kill Isabella and the other characters that become victim to the killer along the way. This movie has a great look. As I mentioned before, Mario Bava's vision is definitely on full display here. Because of the fashion school setting, you get a lot of unique visuals that keep the film feeling really fresh and just fun to look at. All in all, I had a lot of fun with this one, and it was so great to see the little seeds that it planted that would later bloom into what we know now as the Giallo genre. Jumping to the 1970s, I want to take a look at Sergio Martino's All the Colors of the Dark, a film in which a woman named Jane is haunted by nightmares of a mysterious blue-eyed killer. Desperate to end her impending doom, a friend of Jane's recommends that she attend a black mass ceremony, promising that it will put an end to her seemingly inescapable fate. Of all the films I'm talking about today, this one's definitely the most decade-defining. It's a psychedelic paranoia piece with 70s filmmaking written all over it. It's got fun split diopter effects, rapid cuts between extreme close-ups, and there's a lot of striking imagery throughout the film's runtime. The way this film opens could not be more different from what follows it. We get a nice visual of a setting sun with some overlaid credits over it. There's no music or anything, it's just nature sound effects and the setting sun, and then it fades to black. And then immediately is followed up with a hard cut to this nightmare sequence where there's rapid cuts, tight close-ups, very disturbing imagery and creature effects. It's a real splash of cold water to the face of the audience, but we do learn that it is just a dream of our protagonist character, Jane, who recently got in a car accident in which she also lost her baby and is recovering from it. She's being taken care of by her love interest, Richard Steele, who is not the most faithful of partners. And to make matters worse, Jane has continuous visions of a mysterious blue-eyed killer who she eventually does start to see pop up in her day-to-day real life. The movie doesn't really get going until we meet Mary, though, who befriends Jane, and the two of them, after they bond for a little bit, Jane ends up telling Mary about her visions and nightmares. In turn, Mary recommends that Jane go attend a black mass ceremony, which she promises will evaporate any issues that Jane may be having. And of course, Jane is reluctant, but she does end up going, and the black mass sequence itself is probably, in my opinion, one of the more disturbing in the film. It's held in this dark Gothic church that's, damp and dimly lit with candles. The cult themselves, a lot of the members, there's so many of them, they're surrounding Jane in this giant ring. They've got white painted faces. The cult leader himself has these colored long fingernails. Overall, just a creepy guy, sends chills down your spine. But he performs this animal sacrifice. He drinks the blood. He has Jane do the same thing. He kisses Jane. All the cult members kiss her too. It's weird stuff. But we do get some fun split diopter effects here in this scene too. And something else that's very notable is that in this scene, Jane notices a Kabbalistic eye on one of the cult members. And this will come back into play later. But the ritual seems to do the trick miraculously. Jane's visions and nightmares almost immediately go away. And in fact, her quality of life just improves all around pretty quickly after she goes to the Black Mass. But of course that doesn't last long. She starts noticing the blue-eyed man stalking her again in her regular life. Jane hurries home to do some light research on the occult in a book that Richard just happened to have lying around. It's here where she finds a drawing of the Kabbalistic eye in the book, the same one from the day before. Richard returns home and he's none too happy to find Jane snooping around in his stuff. This of course leads to an argument, one of which does not seem to be rare for these two. It seems the more that Richard and Jane keep from each other, the more and more that their relationship starts to decay. However, through another conversation with Mary, Jane learns that the Black Mass is actually a two-parter, and she's got to go back to the church to fully complete the ritual. So she's reluctant again, but desperate to end her nightmare once and for all, Jane agrees and goes back to the Gothic church. But she does learn in that fully completing the ritual, she must sacrifice Mary, which seems like something that Mary probably should have brought up to Jane beforehand, but I guess she never found the time. But Jane does it, and she wakes up the next morning outside of the Gothic church, only to be met by our good old friend Mr. Blue Eyes, who says to Jane that she is now one of them and can't escape. Now this is where the film's pacing becomes nothing short of relentless. Jane seeks psychiatric help again from a character named Dr. Burton, who after multiple reports of Jane seeing the blue-eyed man in real life, finally believes her and agrees to let her stay in this home with an elderly couple that he knows for as long as she wants until she feels safe again. Now, that's some grade A service. But then the blue-eyed man shows up. However, the next morning, Jane wakes up seemingly undisturbed. That is until she goes into the kitchen and finds the elderly couple that she was staying with dead. But the killer, oddly enough, propped the two up to make them appear alive until Jane got really close. The old guy even has a newspaper in his hands. Why the killer did this, I don't know, but it makes for a nice jump scare. Jane leaves the house only to find Dr. Burton in his car, murdered by the blue-eyed man. She then flees to some nearby woods, but not before the blue-eyed man reveals that Jane's mother apparently was also involved in satanic rituals. But this is something that weirdly is never brought back up after this. Okay, from here on out, I have no other choice but to go off script here because a lot happens. In the woods, Jane is apprehended by the blue-eyed man, but is saved just in time by Richard, who kills him. Richard notices the Kabbalistic eye tattoo marked on the man's body, and the two leave the scene. And Richard then pays a visit to Barbara, his secret lover, who also has the same Kabbalistic eye tattooed on her body. It turns out Richard was lured in by Barbara, who tried to seduce him into joining the cult so they could be together forever. Richard doesn't buy this for a second, and he shoots Barbara. This is where the movie takes a turn for Crazy Town, so bear with me here. Jane wakes up in the hospital, and she thinks she sees the cult leader, but is snapped out of it by Richard. He and Jane go back to their apartment. Richard is killed, maybe by Jane? I don't know. But then she's taken away by the cult members who are now dressed up like police officers, back to the Gothic church. She wakes up from another dream and is back in the hospital with Richard. They leave the hospital, go talk to some lawmen who claim to have apprehended the coven and say that Barbara's death was ruled a suicide. So that gives the impression that the events are being covered up by some conspiracy. However, they also tell Jane that her mother left her a large sum of money, so she and Richard don't really question too much. So they return home to a surprise visit from the leader of the cult. And the confrontation ends with Richard throwing the cult leader off of a building. So it's a happy ending, I guess? Maybe? Yeah, I'll be honest, of the three films I'm discussing today, this one's probably my least favorite. There's just so many moments where the story runs off in wildly different directions, and there's a lot of setups that aren't properly paid off. I mean, the stuff with Jane and her car crash and her baby at the beginning, that never comes back into play. The stuff with Jane and her mom, that gets left behind. And there's a lot of character motivations that are a little questionable, with some plot conveniences thrown in there that just kind of left me feeling unfulfilled by the end of it. This type of story actually reminds me quite a bit of something like Hereditary. You know, you've got your two female leads who are both suffering trauma from the recent loss of a loved one. It makes them so desperate that it pushes them to seek help from the occult, only for that to go horribly, horribly wrong and completely shatter their concept of reality. While I do think Hereditary handles this type of story better, it doesn't mean there's nothing to be enjoyed from All the Colors of the Dark. You know, you have Sergio Martino's expert directing style on display here, and his vision really shines through, and I think it really works for this story. You know, despite this being a little more grounded in comparison to something like Blood and Black Lace, there's still a lot of beautiful cinematography to look at here. And we also have Edwige Fenech, who plays Jane, who I actually found out is a multiple-time collaborator with Sergio Martino. And I can definitely see why. She's great here. She really sells the peril of her situation, and she really does a nice job of making you feel sympathy for her. So there's a lot to be enjoyed. You know, you've got your great score that ranges from, you know, bombastically juxtaposed moments to, you know, more subdued, kind of like echoing choir-esque moments that are really creepy. You know, it really helps sell the cult and their kind of eerie aura. I found them to be genuinely scary. There's a lot of moments in and out of the church, the nightmare scene included, that I found to be legitimately scary. So there is a lot I really do like about this movie. It's just that script that I couldn't always buy into. So while it does have its shortcomings, All the Colors of the Dark I still found to be a worthwhile watch, and it definitely has its place in Giallo history. Now, you can't talk about Giallo without at least mentioning Dario Argento. He's essentially one of the poster boys of the subgenre. Now, Argento got his start as a magazine and newspaper columnist, and he eventually worked as a screenwriter, mostly focusing on dramas and westerns. It wouldn't be until his movie The Bird with the Crystal Plumage that Argento would finally dip his toes into Giallo. Argento honed in on his craft throughout the 70s, making films like The Cat o' Nine Tails, Deep Red, and most famously Suspiria. But I'm going to talk about one of his 80s contributions, Tenebre. Tenebre follows author Peter Neal in his business trip he takes to Rome in order to promote his new murder mystery novel. The trip kind of takes a turn for the worst once Peter gets wrapped up into a serial killer case, with the murders and the victims linking pretty closely to the events of Peter's newest novel, Tenebre. Now, Tenebre came out nearly 2 decades after Giallo was conceptualized as a genre in film, so it's actually pretty unique in that it's surprisingly meta and critical of the Giallo genre and kind of slashers as a whole. Now, the most obvious example of this is found in Peter Neal himself, who's essentially a Giallo author. But the movie goes deeper than this. There's a great scene towards the beginning of the film where Peter's met with an old colleague of his. I think her name's Tilde. And she starts questioning Peter's portrayal of women in his novels, which is actually not too dissimilar from the portrayal of women in Giallo movies. You know, they're often sexually objectified and fall victim to gratuitous murder. Now, the conversation between the two characters is cut short, but the ideas presented there develop throughout the runtime of the movie, and even play into Peter's deep character, too. And speaking of characters, I found Tenebre to have one of the most enjoyable cast of characters of any Giallo movie I've seen. There's a lot of really fun duos. There's this pair of detectives that are really fun and they play off of each other really well. But I found the most enjoyable pair to be Peter and his assistant Anne, who kind of have a blossoming will they won't they type relationship that's strained by Peter's recent divorce of his ex-wife Jane, who becomes a very important character as the movie goes along. Peter notices Jane is in Rome, or maybe it's someone who kind of looks like her, and as the movie goes along, Peter becomes like progressively more and more interested in why his ex-wife is in Rome and what her whereabouts are and her motivations for being in the capital city. But wait, there's a killer too. Do you remember how I said this movie has some satirical elements to it? Well, there's more than a few examples of this, but I think one of my favorites is when a character by the name of Maria, who's the daughter of a hotel manager at the place Peter's staying at, gets chased by a rabid dog in a harrowing scene that does have dramatic weight to it, but it plays almost exactly like a final girl chase scene in a slasher movie. It's also worth noting that Tenebre was released just 4 years after Halloween. In an attempt to escape the dog, Maria breaks into a nearby house that just so happens to be the killer's lair. Now, there's a really clever bit of set design here, where the deeper Maria goes into the room, the more pieces of set dressing around her are red. And in true Giallo fashion, red is used as a signifier for danger, but it also plays with the idea here. For example, there's a scene, several scenes actually, where Anne's driving a red car, but she ends up being unscathed. So they kind of play with the audience's expectations and understanding of the color red, and because of this, it gives Tenebre a really uneasy, tense feeling that makes it really fun to watch. So as the mystery unfolds, we start to learn more about the killer's true motivations. He targets those he deems to be deviants, sexually active women, prostitutes, homosexuals, and adulterers. The killings in Peter's actual novel, Tenebre, are of a religious nature, and the murders that happen in the movie itself seem to follow suit. Now, it's made clear in both the movie and in Peter's novel that the killer is insane, but as the movie goes along and we learn more about Peter Neal, you kind of start to question if he doesn't share some of the same sentiments as the killer. The serial killer himself speaks solely in a piercing, whispered voice that, while not uncommon for Giallo movies, strikes a specific chord here, seeing as the movie was made around the period of time in which Paul Michael Stefani, aka the weepy-voiced killer, committed several violent crimes. Stefani was actually apprehended just a few months before the official release of Tenebre. A lot of this can definitely be chalked up to coincidence, but the parallels are definitely there, making me wonder if there wasn't inspiration. So while Tenebre is definitely the most introspective of the 3 Giallo movies I'm discussing today, I wouldn't call it a full-blown deconstruction. There's still a lot of traditional Giallo elements on display here. There's some well-executed death scenes, some great scenes of tension, and beautiful visuals. It's a really entertaining mystery that keeps you guessing the whole time, and the psychoanalyzation of its main character was an element that I was really pleasantly surprised by. So by this point in the 1980s, Giallo had definitely found its footing in the world of cinema, with Tenebre acting as a welcome addition to that. Of course, the genre would go on to change and evolve over the years. I mean, heck, it still is to this day. I wanted to stop specifically at the 1980s because I feel like it was at this point where Giallo had formed a level of familiarity that most people associate it with. It'll definitely be fun to go and check out the new movies within the genre that kind of reinvent the wheel. But I definitely had a ton of fun going back in time to see the movies that inspired all of that. So thank you guys so much for watching. Definitely stick around for new horror and Halloween themed videos throughout the month of October. And as always guys, until next time, stay tuned.